Me really doesn't want to do this episode, and another part of me, the bigger part of me, knows it is this struggle that makes this episode so important. I think that the most important history we learn is the difficult history, the ugly history, the history that shows us the lowest part of humanity so that we may always seek to be better, to do better. So, in this vein, here is this episode 7.8 Mass Atrocities After 1900. In 2016, I took a class on refugees in the 20th century, and the professor, Mark Levine, started the course by examining the transition from empire to nation state as one of the primary creators of refugees. As we moved into the 20th century, a recurring theme in the creation of refugees was how a nation state defines who belongs and who doesn't, and how that contributes to the movement of populations. I bring this up because another of Dr. Levine's arguments is going to undergird or support our discussion of mass atrocities in this episode. What I'm really going to be looking at in this episode is more of a theoretical understanding of genocide and mass atrocity as opposed to going through specifics of specific atrocity events. One of the biggest issues with the idea of mass atrocity is that they are not new to the 20th century. The Mongols piled heads up as high as houses. The Spanish arrival in the Americas, the Taiping Rebellion, and other uprisings cost China 100 million people in the middle of the 1800s, and Shaka Zulu's Mfakane, or Great Crushing, proportionally created a similar result. So why is the 20th century different? It is that century, for example, that gives a name to this: genocide, the purposeful and organized annihilation of a people. The definition of genocide is still a bit fuzzy. In his article titled "Why is the 20th Century the Century of Genocide?" Mark Levine will try and talk us through it. One of the biggest contradictions in the 20th century genocides is where they do and where they don't seem to happen. For example, the earliest nation states in the sense of the word, the United States, France, and later the United Kingdom, don't seem to struggle with this idea of genocide. Obviously, we could comment on the treatment of Native nations in the US, the Vendée region in France during the Revolution, and the treatment of the Irish as examples of horrific treatment and often purposeful violence against those minority groups. However, when we think about genocides, a few come to mind instead. The Armenian genocide at the end of the First World War, the Soviet purge of Ukrainians in 1932 to 1933, the Holocaust during World War II, Rwanda in 1994, and the former Yugoslavia in the late 1990s. There are others, but these are the primary ones, which seems a weird thing to say. What Levine claims is that the practitioners of genocide seem to share a, quote, particularly acute anxiety about the wide and ever-increasing gap between themselves and the global leaders within the international system, but in relationship to their special sense of a historic, or even a mythic, tradition of pre-modern coherence, authority, or imperium, both in regard to their own societies and or in a broader regional or continental arena. Thus, genocide states or societies have been the ones with the strongest and most persistent complexes about having been blocked off from a position within the international system, which they believe on past historic record ought to be theirs, have been prone to support leaderships who articulated this anger and resentment, and consequently also have been the most likely to radicalize their domestic arrangements as well as foreign policies in ways that consciously contravened or challenged the system's, quote, liberal and inclusivist ground rules, end quote. So basically, the countries that seem to shift towards genocide seem to feel that they are somehow not getting what they're owed from the international system, and so are within their rights to abandon the said system and become radicalized. Then, in order to, quote, catch up, something radical needs to be done. Rather than modernizing or embracing technology, they seek to mobilize a, quote, distinct national people to generate this power. It seems that for a regime to make this shift, some upheaval that caused the questioning of traditional power systems is necessary. So wars, the Great Depression, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, these types of big traumas. So how do we go from this radicalization to the mass murder of entire peoples? Levine has some ideas for us. He says that, quote, their victims do not ultimately suffer genocide simply because they did not fit a regime's perception of people homogeneity, sameness. They suffered genocide because the finger was pointed at them as the group or groups accused of actively disrupting or polluting the state's drive to transcend its limitations. And what is most shocking, he says, that there ends up being the complete absence of any evidence that such intentions or even abilities exist coming from the targeted group. It seems to be an imagined community of enemies, to be the equal and opposite reaction to the imagined community of the nation. I'll link to another video in which I discuss the Holocaust at some length, and we will talk about some pretty rough topics in class. But I also wanted to be sure to discuss the effects of these mass atrocities in the 20th century, besides the tragedy of population loss. There are 3 major genocides before the creation of the UN and, well, several afterwards. So that begs the question of what exactly came from the fact that these tragedies led to the creation of a political body intended to diminish their occurrence. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer, had been working for years to try and get mass murder recognized as internationally illegal even before the Holocaust. But during World War II, he redoubled his efforts. Following his role as an advisor at the Nuremberg trials, he convinced the new United Nations to adopt the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Yet, the Cold War and its aftermath of hurried nation building give rise to more genocides. The communist Pol Pot regime killing millions of his fellow Cambodians during the Khmer Rouge, Indonesia massacring 1/3 of the population of the island of East Timor, Slobodan Milosevic and the, quote, ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia and Kosovo at the end of the 1990s, Saddam Hussein using chemical warfare to gas between 50,000 and 185,000 Kurds in northern Iraq in the 1980s, the Hutu militias murdering almost 500,000 Tutsis in the 1994 Rwandan genocide, and the Darfur genocide in Sudan. This is not an exhaustive list. That is not all of them. So it would seem that the prevention of genocide has not really been a thing. Levine argues that this is because the nation state is held so sacred and inviolable by our international agencies like the UN that if a perpetrator country can make some claim about rebels or civil unrest, the UN can't get involved in these internal problems. They don't involve themselves in civil wars. The counter to that, of course, is that the majority of these situations are dramatically one-sided, like the Holocaust. And so the idea of a civil war is a flimsy cover for what's really happening. But a paper shield is better than no shield at all, and so our best efforts, the efforts of the most technologically advanced and humanitarian societies yet, have been unable to stop the wholesale elimination of entire groups of people. Yay. Well, that's it for me on this. Watch the Holocaust video for more. There's a movie called Hotel Rwanda about the Rwandan genocide. It features Don Cheadle, which it's rated R, so definitely get your parents' permission, and also be sure to stock a box of tissues for yourself because it is really horrible. So thanks for watching. And don't forget to like and subscribe so that you never miss an episode.